So today's lesson is on Mendelian genetics, and this will continue our discussion of genetics. We'll begin with some important vocabulary. Inheritance is the passing of traits to the next generation. So this is why you might have your dad's nose or you might have your mom's hair. Genetics is the science of heredity, so the way in which we study how traits get passed from one generation to the next generation. Remember that I called this Mendelian genetics. This is named after a famous scientist named Gregor Mendel. He published important work about genetics in 1866. He was born in 1822 and died in 1884. He was actually an Austrian monk who worked in the garden at a monastery, and his observations of pea plants are what he became famous for. He grew these and they became the foundation of modern genetics. Mendel demonstrated how the inheritance of traits in pea plants follows specific patterns. From this we get what is called the laws of Mendelian genetics, which I'm going to go over later in this lesson. So here we have two peas. We have a yellow pea and we have a green pea. When these two peas, which we will call the parental generation or P for parental, the pea generation, when they have offspring, you would probably think that you would end up with 50% yellow, 50% green, or that you would end up with 100% yellow-greenish peas. But what Mendel actually discovered is that this next generation, called the first filial generation, or F1, this F1 generation was actually 100% yellow, which just seems kind of weird because that's not what you would generally predict. He then decided to see what would happen if you had offspring from the first filial generation. So if these two, for example, had offspring. He discovered that when these two have offspring, they create what's called the second filial generation. And you would think that because their parents were 100% yellow, that they would also be 100% yellow. But instead, he actually discovered that there was a mix of yellow and green peas, and that there were actually 622 yellow to 2,001 green. So this actually reduces down to a ratio of about 3 yellow to 1 green, which seems kind of interesting. And how this actually works is what we're going to be going over this lesson. Before we jump into how Mendels Peas actually worked, we first need to discuss a new vocabulary word. So remember how we had homologous chromosomes? So these are my homologous chromosomes. One chromosome from each parent, so from mom, from dad. They're the same length, they have the same centromere positions, and they carry the genes for the same type of traits. These genes are actually called alleles. So for example, if this gene right here and this gene right here both carry the gene for nose shape, that would be the actual alleles. So an allele, it is a single gene passed from generation to generation. So these chromosomes contain tons and tons of alleles. You can just find, for example, one of them right here, and then there might be another one right here, there might be another one right here for different kinds of traits. So an example would be the two forms of a seed trait in pea plants. So if I'm looking at a yellow seed and a green seed, these both code for color. However, one of them codes for yellow, one of them codes for green. Those would be our alleles. So let's apply this idea of alleles. Alleles actually have different types of what we call dominance. Dominance meaning kind of, is it stronger? In this example, we can see that when yellow and green have offspring, you end up with all yellow. This tells us that the dominant allele is actually yellow. And that would leave the green allele to be recessive, because this green was actually masked, kind of hidden, by the yellow dominant, which is why our peas ended up being yellow. For kind of the way in which we write things in science, the dominant one is going to be a capital Y, and then the recessive allele is going to be a lowercase y. So Y for yellow, because yellow is dominant, and then we just use a little y for the green allele. Every single pea has two alleles, and we're going to talk about how this affects the actual color that you see. In order to understand how a dominant allele allele and a recessive allele interact. We're going to talk about a game that you should probably be familiar with. It's called rock, paper, scissors, except we're going to ignore scissors because they're just sharp. I don't really like scissors. So we're going to look at rock and we're going to look at paper. Remember that rock is a fist and paper is an open hand, and that paper always beats rock. So make sure that you have your hands ready to play rock, paper, scissors with yourself. So like I said, paper always beats rock, and in the same way we're going to say that our paper, an open hand, is our big Y, which is dominant. This kind of makes sense because a big Y is larger than a little y, kind of like our paper is bigger than our rock. And then we're going to say that our rock is going to be our green or recessive allele. Before we get to our rock, paper, scissors game, minus the scissors, we need to talk about some important vocab. A genotype is the organism's allele pairs. So like I said, all of the peas, all of the traits that we find will have two different alleles. So here we have two different ones, here we have two different ones, and etc., etc. Those alleles can either be big Y, or little y, or big Y, little y. The phenotype is actually what you see, so that would actually be the color. So do you see the color yellow or do you see the color green? This is the observable characteristic or the outward expression of an allele pair. Alright, so rock and paper. If I have a genotype that has two dominant alleles, here we can see our big Y, I'm going to put my left hand as paper and my right hand as paper, so I want you to do this. However, if you do paper versus paper, this is going to be a tie. So I know that my phenotype is actually going to end up being yellow. However, if I have a genotype that has a dominant yellow allele and one recessive green allele, or big Y and little y, then I can put my left hand as paper and my right hand as rock. So go ahead and do that. We know that paper beats rock, so we know that the yellow color wins and that the pea's phenotype ends up being yellow. Lastly, if I have a genotype with two recessive green alleles, or little y, then I end up with a tie between two rocks, which means that my phenotype is going to end up being green. Alright, so really quickly, some vocabulary words. If you have a genotype with two of the same alleles, it is going to either be homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. If the two alleles are dominant, so the big Y, or the yellow, then it is going to be homozygous dominant. If the genotype contains the two alleles that are both recessive, that means that it's going to be homozygous recessive. All right? And then finally, if I have two different alleles, so for example, one dominant and one recessive, then it's going to be considered heterozygous. So keep in mind that the word homo means same, and the word hetero means different. So that's how we know homozygous dominant means the same alleles for dominant, homozygous recessive means the same alleles for recessive, and heterozygous means one of each allele. So here's a practice problem. In pea plants, the purple flower allele is dominant, while the white flower allele is recessive. Determine the type of genotype, which means, for example, you should say, is it homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and then determine the phenotype for the following allele pairs. Pause the video and answer the problem. Alright, for two of the same dominant alleles, we know that this must be homozygous. All right, homozygous. And we know that they are both dominant. So we know that this is homozygous dominant. For two alleles that are different, we know that that is going to be heterozygous, because there is a dominant and a recessive allele. Lastly, if I have two alleles that are the same, and they are both recessive, that means that they should be homozygous recessive. So then what would the phenotype be? if they're both, you can use your rock and paper method to figure out what the phenotype is. Two dominant alleles would be two paper hands. That's a tie. That means the phenotype must be exactly the same as the dominant allele. So in this case, it would be purple. A dominant and a recessive allele would be a paper hand and a rock hand. So paper defeats rock, so that means that the phenotype would be the same as the dominant allele. So again, this would be purple. Two recessive alleles would be two rock hands. This would be a tie, and that must mean that the phenotype is the same as the recessive allele, or in this case, white. Hopefully you're beginning to see a pattern by now, and you're beginning to recognize how alleles actually interact to give us an outward characteristic or phenotype. Remember when I said that Mendel had laws? This is the first one, and it is called the law of segregation. This states that the two alleles for each trait must separate during meiosis. This makes sense if you think back to how our homologous chromosome pairs separated from each other during meiosis. Each gamete gets one of the chromosomes from the homologous pair. So the homozygous dominant yellow pea must have gametes, you can see gamete formation, where 50% of them end up being dominant yellow, and the other 50% must also end up being dominant yellow. That means that the homozygous recessive green pea, when its gametes are formed, 50% of the gametes formed will have the recessive green allele, and the other 50% must also have that recessive green allele. So if any of the gametes from the homozygous dominant pea mate with the homozygous recessive pea, you're going to end up with a heterozygous yellow pea. This is why the P generation, the letter P generation, when it created its F1 generation, the first filial generation, the result was 100% yellow peas.